This is the Sports Business Classroom audio experience with Brittni Donaldson. Hey everyone, I am Howard Beck, and I will be your host for the next 4 episodes of this podcast as we delve into basketball analytics, the whys and hows, the do's and the don'ts, with a series of experts who, frankly, know way more than I do on the subject. I guarantee you I will be learning as much as you will be, and frankly, that was part of my goal in devising this series. You see, I've been covering the NBA as a journalist for 26 years, and a lot has changed in that time. The way the game is played, the way it's covered, the way we analyze it and discuss it. And when it comes to statistics, that discussion has changed dramatically, even just over the last 5 to 10 years. The tools we use, the terminology, the vast amount of data that's available now. Our conversations about the game are smarter now because of it all, but, well, it can be enough to make your head spin too. I've done my best as a reporter to learn as much as I can, but I still get tripped up at times, and I've often thought, why isn't there a course we can all take, fans and media alike, to learn how to best use all these new stats? My friends at the Sports Business Classroom agreed, and so here we are, a 4-part series to make us all a little smarter with guidance from some of the sharpest people working in basketball analytics. Welcome to our 4th and final episode of our basketball analytics series, and really happy to close out the series with today's guest, Brittni Donaldson, who brings a really unique perspective to this discussion. Brittni played 4 years at Northern Iowa, so she knows the game from the player perspective, but she also graduated with a degree in statistics and actuarial sciences, so she is also an expert in analytics. That's a rare combination in this league. Brittni recently joined the Atlanta Hawks as an assistant on Quinn Snyder's staff, so she is bringing to bear all of her expertise, both on and off the court, for the Hawks. She previously worked in both the front office and on the bench for the Toronto Raptors, and she also spent a year as an assistant coach with the Detroit Pistons. We've talked throughout this series about best practices for media and fans, which stats to use, what to avoid, how to better understand all the new data that's out there. But what about the teams? How does a front office put analytics to use? What about the coaching staffs? And how do coaches and players respond to all this new data that teams provide them? Also, how big is the gap between what the teams are talking about behind closed doors versus what we are discussing out in the public sphere among media and fans? Brittni gives us a little glimpse into all of that in today's show. If you missed our first 3 episodes with Kevin Pelton, Corey Jez, and Ben Taylor, you can find them all in this same feed. You don't need to listen in order necessarily, but we did cover some of the basics in episode 1. We tackled some of the all-in-one stats in episode 2, and we delved into defense in episode 3. So if you're new to all this, it could be helpful to get that overview first. Regardless, I think you're going to really enjoy this discussion today with Brittni Donaldson. Okay, let's get to it. Now, very pleased to be joined by Brittni Donaldson. Thank you for joining us, and amidst the hubbub of Summer League, no less. I know you've had a lot to do on the court, so appreciate you taking some time. This is the first one of these, the only one of these we've actually gotten to do in person. We've been limited to Zoom up until now. So good to see you. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to jump right in with just kind of how you got here, not with the Hawks in particular or the Raptors job or the Pistons job, but you have a unique profile in that you played the game in college, and now you are in this analytics category, and I think people still, to this day, probably are still trying to kind of join those two in their own minds, right? They think of people as either being the basketball types or the numbers types. You are absolutely the true coalescing of both of them. I'm sure the basketball came first. When did the basketball passions meet the passions and interest in the numbers of the game, and how those two things can help each other?
Yeah, great question. First of all, thanks for having me. Really
Absolutely.
excited to be here. So like you mentioned, I grew up playing basketball. I ended up playing in college. Had aspirations to play professionally. Underwent 4 knee operations in college, so I had to cut my career short and had to decide, what am I going to do with my life now? Because I'm not going to be a basketball player. So I happened to be studying statistics and actuarial science at the time. I really had no plan with that at the time. Basketball was my priority. That was just something that came naturally to me and pretty easy to me. I knew I'd be missing a lot of class, so I'm like, this will be this will be easier for me to like catch up on when I'm gone. But every project we had in any of my courses, I would always gravitate towards analyzing some sort of sport-specific problem or with sport-specific data. Even sometimes using my own stats, my playing stats. I would sometimes like make projects around my own like style of play or whatever. So it was actually a professor that brought it up to me at the time as my career was winding down. He was like, I noticed that you tend to like gravitate towards this specific type of problem. Did you know that professional teams are like hiring analysts right now in like their front offices? And I didn't know that at the time. Moneyball had came out maybe 5 or 6 years earlier. Baseball was like heavy into the analytics at the time. I didn't know that this existed in basketball. So that kind of sparked, my interest. And after graduating from school, I applied for a ton of jobs in sport. With anything with analyst in the title that was working for some sort of sport organization, whether it was media, a team, I was applying to it. Eventually landed at StatsLLC, and now it's Stats Perform in Chicago. So it was just fresh off of, them signing the deal with the NBA to partner with them using their SportView player tracking data product. So I started at Stats as an analyst, actually like watching NBA games through the SportView cameras and making sure the data was being collected properly and that it was clean, and making sure the players were tagged correctly and all of those things. And then eventually, through that experience, moved up in the company to more of a front-facing data analyst. So now I'm interacting with clients. Now I'm talking to NBA teams, creating reports for them. And through that, I made connections and eventually landed a job in the Raptors front office as a data analyst. So, like you said, a bit of an unconventional journey, but I wouldn't have done it any other way.
No, that's fantastic. We talk about analytics giving us a different kind of insight or helping inform the insights, the observations that we make about the game along the way. And again, people I think are still coming to terms with how best to utilize all of that and where it matches up and when it doesn't, and where some stuff that might mislead us a little bit. Was there any aha moment along the way for you, whether it was you crunching the numbers about your own career in college, or whether it was simply as you're learning to use all the tracking tools and everything else we now have available to us? Was there a moment where you thought, as the player first, you know what, this isn't just superimposing some formulas on top of this. This is actually telling us something or bolstering something that we thought we knew. Was there an aha moment in there somewhere?
Yeah, for me, it's never been like a dichotomy of like it's numbers versus IQ, it's numbers versus feel. Like it's never been that for me. Like intuitively, it's always been merged. And to me, it's like the data can inform decisions you might want to make on the court, or like directions you might want to go as far as analyzing the game or just seeing it through a different lens. But then also like having high-level basketball expertise and basketball experience and that sort of intuition you have, whether it's playing the game or coaching the game, can also inform, like, with this immense amount of data, what should I be looking at? What should I care about? What are the things that we should be trying to figure out using data? So they're very much intertwined. Like, I don't think you can make, the best decisions that you make are going to use both sides per se. Yeah. So it's funny that a lot of people ask me about, how can you be both? And it's like, well, to me, that's how it should be. Yeah. It should never be one or the other.
Do you think your teammates in Northern Iowa would have shared that view? Like, you had a head for the numbers, obviously. You were geared in this direction, and so it made sense to you that that there's not a dichotomy, as you said. These things it's all one and the same. It's just different ways or vantage points or data points, literally, of looking at it. Would your teammates at that time have embraced it in the same way? And, of course, obviously, where I'm leading with this is eventually how your current players that you're working with embrace this. But did you find along the way that there has been that resistance? Yeah,
I think more and more, whether it's coaches or players or people that interact with the game, are becoming more familiar with using this type of information. I think it's less about them being resistant and more about the people that are, whether they're presenting this information or using this information, it's their approach to it, right? Like, I'm not going to approach a coach or a player from a perspective of like, this is what the numbers say, and you should listen to this, because I'm almost discrediting their expertise and their point of view. And I think anytime you come at it that way, there's going to be resistance and pushback. So it's really, to me, like, I say like 90% of my job is actually just the communication part, the building trust, the building the relationships, speaking different languages. I call myself a translator because I do. I want to lead with the language that the person is most familiar with that I'm talking to. I think if you take care of that first, like, everybody will be very receptive to it, because ultimately it's meant to be used as a tool and not a weapon. And that can sometimes be a very fine line. Yeah.
Yes. And somehow, despite all the years that we have been talking about analytics and everybody operating in this space, there still seems to be a little bit of that tension in the discourse sometimes, right? And I'm sure you see it across the league, right? Not every coach probably or executive is as receptive as the next one, even though we are a good 10 years or so into this era.
Yeah. Again, it's at the end of the day, we're all talking about basketball, and that's what we have to make it about. You mentioned it before. We're just trying to look at it from different vantage points through different lenses. It's not this against that. Yeah. It's very much a merging of different vantage points. And again, the more you can come across in a way that's like collaborative and not like a surveillance thing. Like, players will not be receptive if they feel like you're just monitoring them. Yeah. If you actually engage with them in a way that's like, no, this is yours, you own this, you have ownership over this, you can interact with it yourself, let's talk about it, they're way more receptive to it. So really, it's all about your approach, in my opinion.
I promised the Hawks that I would not ask you anything proprietary. We're not looking for any deep, dark trade secrets here, but one of my goals in this series is to give fans a better insight into how the analytics are actually used on a practical level. If there's an example you could cite, without necessarily, you don't have to name the player, but you can if you're comfortable with it, whether it was your time with the Raptors or the Pistons or with the Hawks. What is one of these conversations like when you're actually going to them and saying, listen, I've got this stack of information, this Excel spreadsheet. I'm sure it's probably not literally the Excel spreadsheet, but how does that conversation go? And what are you bringing to them if it's not the spreadsheet or the stack of data from Synergy? Yeah,
I guess to kind of zoom out a bit, an organization uses data, depending on where you are in the organization, you're going to use data very, very differently. So if you're in the front office and you're more concerned about constructing a roster, you're going to be more concerned with different types of metrics and, maybe more like valuation metrics. Like, how does this player stack up against other players in the league? What is this player worth now? What could they be worth in the future? Those are the types of questions you're really trying to answer. On the coaching side, we don't really care about that, right? We care about when we play Milwaukee tomorrow night, like, how are we going to guard the Giannis, Brook Lopez pick and roll? Like, that's the type of question we want to answer. We want to know with our own players, what have their tendencies been? How have they been trending in certain areas that we care about? How can we construct a practice or a workout to cater to those things? And at the end of the day, like, the players might not ever receive the information from a data standpoint, because we kind of, as coaches, make the decisions and drive the design of what we do kind of around what the data is suggesting. But it's actually pretty rare for me to interact with the player directly and be like, here's a spreadsheet of your numbers. Like, I think some players are more interested in others in that regard. But with the data we have right now, it's more about strategy. And I think we're trending in a direction where eventually the players will be using data maybe in a different way themselves, whether it's biomechanical data, kind of like what baseball is doing right now. They're getting instant feedback. Maybe it's shooting. Maybe we start with something with shooting, and they're getting instant feedback every shot they take, and now they can self-correct and self-adjust based on the data that they see. And that's kind of the direction I see, like, player development going, and that's when I think players will interact with the data more directly. But it's funny, like, I think I get that question a lot about, like, how do players respond to this? And at the end of the day, like, the players don't really interact with the data directly a ton. Now, there are caveats, and there are certain players who have, come to me directly. And that's really exciting, because if they come to me, there's obviously no resistance. Like, they're the ones that are interested. Yeah. I had a couple players in Toronto in particular, as I was there for longer. I was there for 4 years, and was able to build relationships with these players and be on the court with them and learn about them. And as they started to learn more about what I did, they would start to ask me questions, and then we would kind of go from there. But it takes time. You're not just gonna, I just got to Atlanta. I haven't had the time yet with my players to really get there yet, but I think we will eventually. But even at the same time, I don't think it's like necessary for the players to interact with it directly at this moment.
For the players who are the most curious about it and want to seek out that information because that's just part of their natural curiosity, they're trying to improve their game, they're trying to maybe improve their shot selection or how they're attacking a certain kind of defense. Is there, like, what's a question they would ask you? Like when someone has actually come to you and said, Brittni, I'm trying to figure this thing out. You've got all this info. You've got this amazing computer and all these spreadsheets. What can you tell me about X? What are they asking about?
So the players that have asked me for information actually don't really know what they're looking for, which is pretty common because why would they? They've never really seen the capabilities of the data or what the data can provide. So a lot of times it's me kind of guiding the question, which also, a big part of my job is not just giving answers, but it's making sure we're asking the right questions.
Sure.
Because it's one thing to just provide a bunch of information, but it's another thing to like direct the question or what we're trying to analyze the right way and make it the most efficient and get to what we really want to get to. But players will ask about decision making, like, hey, when I tend to come off the pick and roll, maybe if I tend to take 2 dribbles versus 1, like what's my efficiency there? Like what's my best decision out of pick and roll and what's my worst, and how can I work on whatever I need to work on? And it's things like that that they're interested in. But again, I think most of them don't even know really what to ask, right? Because they're not super familiar with what we can provide.
So they might actually just come to you and just say, in general, listen.
What can you give me? Yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And what do you usually end up coming to them with? Do you know off the top of your head for a specific player something that you already had it in the office, you were just waiting for the moment to be able to provide that? Or do you actually end up going, give me a sec and go drill down on that particular player? Are there things that I'll just leap out?
Yeah, I think it's a very collaborative process. So if a player were to ask me that, I would definitely want to kind of go to the drawing board, really do a deep dive on the player, but then also connect with maybe that player's coach who they work with every single day. And like, hey, what have you guys been working on? What have been your points of emphasis? Because the last thing I want to do is give a player something that contradicts maybe what a coach has said.
Sure.
So it has to be a very collaborative process, and then the player has so many voices in their ear. They have their agent, they have the front office, they have their coach, they have their family, so you have to be really cognizant of that.
Sure.
And really come at it from a place of love and support and collaboration, and not from a place of like, you should do what I say.
All right, so let me do it as just kind of a hypothetical, kind of like the most obvious thing, right? Guy's in a slump. He's always been a great three-point shooter or maybe a great mid-range shooter from a specific spot, and he comes to you and says, like, I don't know what's going on. My field goal percentage is down by 5 points over the last couple months or this season. And the what do you got question, right? So what do you got? What is the way that you begin to attack that question? And that may be a ridiculous question, or maybe it's the most obvious one, right?
Yeah.
Guys are always going to be looking for ways to improve their efficiency. You hope that they want to improve their shot selection, but what's the way that you break down that kind of question?
Yeah, you just hinted at it. I think the first thing I would do is look at the quality of shots that they've been taking, because a lot of times if their field goal percentage drops, they might just be taking more difficult shots. So we're really more concerned with the process and the behavior over necessarily the outcome, because a lot of times we want to know, like, what was your expected percentage here versus the actual percentage, especially in a small sample. You could have a couple cold games, but you're maybe getting great shots. We're not going to tell you not to shoot the ball. Like, those are shots we want you to take. So we really try and evaluate, based on a lot of different factors, what's the quality of the shots that we're getting? Are we happy with the possession, with the shot, whatever you want to really focus on? And that's where I would start. So are you taking the shots that we want you to take? Are you taking shots that you make at a high rate? And then from there, if they are doing that and they're still missing, and it's enough of a sample where it's like, something might be going on here, then you try to dig into maybe more of like the mechanics of the shot or something like that. We do have data on ball trajectory and if you're missing short, long, left, right, both in games and in our practice facility. So we can look back at like, over the last 2 weeks in the practice facility and in the games, are you missing short? Are you missing left? Like, what's going on here? And there was actually a case with a player in Toronto where he had been missing short for like 2 weeks straight. And we showed him the data like, hey, 60% of your misses, you're missing short. And so from then on out, in our practice facility, we have technology that gives you immediate feedback on every shot that you take, how short, long, left, right it is, or what arc it's at, or whatever you want to focus on. And we would gamify sort of his workouts and say, hey, not only do you have to make 8 out of 10, but those 8, like, are the ones that you miss can't be short. Essentially, if you have a missed short, you have to start all over. So like now we're just changing the emphasis, and now he's interacting with the data directly without even realizing it.
And you're retraining muscle memory in a way too, right? Because you're trying to get him to get in the habit of putting just a little bit more on it.
Yeah. And we're not like showing him a spreadsheet, right? It's just, it's a creative way to have them interact with it and make it feel like it's theirs, and it's not like a surveillance mechanism of some sort, but they're using it as a tool to improve themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it often that? Is it that there was something mechanical, or maybe maybe the knees are sore that week and so they're not quite getting as much lift, or do you find that it actually ends up being more like shot selection? Like, no, you're just not taking the best shots, because I feel like those are the harder conversations sometimes with players, right?
Yeah.
It's because everybody just, everybody wants to shoot. Who doesn't want to shoot?
Yeah, I think it totally depends on the situation. The performance medical side of it is a whole nother part I haven't even mentioned yet, but like they also use data to evaluate, how much load has this player been putting on their body, if they're recovering from an injury, have we ramped them up too fast, have they been playing too many minutes? Like, this is all being taken into account, and so that could also be a factor, and I think the answer at the end of the day is it's never going to be just one thing. It might be a bunch of different little things. And at the end of the day, we're not trying to, solve something all at once or like hit a home run every time. We're just trying to make little small improvements here and there. And I think that's something everybody should try and understand too, is like, everything we do, it might be an incremental improvement. You're not going to see like a drastic improvement based on a data recommendation in a short amount of time.
Yeah. What are those misnomers you think, the most common ones that fans might have, or us in the media for that matter, might have about the day-to-day use? I think a lot of us feel like, well, coaching staffs are probably looking at lineup data, right? And want to see which combinations, 2-man, 3-man, 4-man, 5-man combinations are doing the best, and which guys don't function as well with each other. And, if we have these 2 non-shooters in the lineup, what does it tell us? And is it as bad as we think instinctively it might be, or intuitively that it might be? I think it's a lot of. I think the lineup data part of it is the thing that we talk about most in a public sphere. Is that a misnomer? What are the areas that are probably more common that we may not be aware of?
Yeah, I think lineup data, you have to be very careful with it. I think what's publicly available is missing a lot of context. And so, well, first of all, sometimes it's like the small sample problem where we can look at a lineup and come to a conclusion, but then we look and it's like, oh, they've only played, 6 total minutes together in the last 2 weeks. It's like, okay, well, let's think about that a little more deeply. And then, I think the context part, so there's a lot more to just like who's on the floor. It's matchups, it's who we're playing, it's like the scheme we're trying to implement. There's a lot of things that we need to take into account versus just looking at who's on the court. It's rather complicated, and so we do use lineup data as a guide, but we don't use it as law, I would say. It's something to inform us and maybe point our eyes in a direction that we should focus on. But we're not going to look at lineup data and say, oh, we can never play this lineup together. Like, we're going to dig a little deeper. If we see that the lineup on paper is struggling, we're going to watch that lineup and see what we see. And maybe it's, oh, that was just a really bad matchup that game. Or like maybe it's, it could be something else. So I think just, there's context that within an organization we have the tools and the resources and the knowledge because we know our team so well and so intimately that, I think the general public maybe doesn't have all of the context.
Yeah. And I understand too, like a lot of the publicly available data is not quite as, accurate or revealing as maybe a lot of what you guys have that's more proprietary, right?
Yeah, I would say, we have definitely more, specific, sophisticated maybe tools that we use. And just, like I said, we just know our team really, really well. We're with them every single day. And we know, like not just the players, but the people too. And we have to remember at the end of the day, like these are people. These aren't like dots on a page. It's
although the tracking cameras think they're just dots on a page,
that's
right?
right. Yeah. Which, you have to sometimes be like, oh yeah, like there's certain things here that maybe a model isn't capturing, or that advanced metric just cannot capture, that we know, that we still have to use as a data point when making a decision.
So in the course of a given week or month, are there specific kinds of data that you are referencing more often, or categories of data, types of data that you're bringing to bear? What would be the ones that maybe fans aren't quite aware of?
Yeah, I think on the coaching side, specifically, we're really concerned with mainly like 3 things: our upcoming opponents and scouting reports, basically. What are their tendencies, their behaviors? How efficient are they when doing those things, both at the team level and the individual level? How will we combat what they do? And then we're looking at our own team over time, the last 10 games, the last 20 games, different trends we see throughout our team based on the principles we care about. So every team might care about very different things. So I don't think there's like a stat that every team is going to care about. I think it's really dependent on the head coach, what he or she wants to do, what they want to focus on, the personnel that's on your team, the strengths and weaknesses of every single player on the team, and how that all fits together. Again, it's very complex.
For sure. It touches on something I was curious about, though. Like, you've worked for 3 different organizations now, and obviously different capacities, too, front office to bench and so forth. Do you find that those conversations are different? Not the receptiveness. Obviously, all of these teams have invested in analytics to a degree that indicates that they obviously value it. So I don't mean necessarily about the resistance, but just, are the conversations different because they might just see the game differently than the last people you worked with, or organizational goals might be a little different, or you were with a Raptors team that obviously was competing at a very high level for much of your time there, and then a Pistons team that was definitely in a rebuild, and now to a Hawks team that's somewhere in between those two things. So I imagine the goals might influence the conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think everybody's end goal is going to be somewhat the same, right? We want to maximize our roster. We want to win games. But once you get into the nitty-gritty of it and the nuances of exactly what we're trying to optimize, like, those things might look a little different based on your personnel, based on where your organization's at, based on your leadership. But then the other thing that kind of varies from organization to organization, and we're like 10 years, 15 years into this sort of thing now, and you would think by now kind of every team is at the same level as far as resources and infrastructure, but really that's not quite true. So some teams, pour more investment into an analytics staff. You have a bunch of data scientists, data engineers. You have maybe a UX, UI designer that's building cool tools for the, internal staff. But then some teams are more in like a startup phase. So maybe you have 3 or 4 people that run your whole analytics department. So I think that's the thing I've noticed the most, just kind of like, what resources do I have? Like, how much coding will I have to do? Or is somebody going to do that for me? Kind of just this age and stage of like where the department is definitely different for each organization.
And I'm curious, too, because as we said, we're, guessing 10, 15 years, whatever the analytics era span has been. But there are now players coming into the league having grown up from the time that they were, maybe 10, 12 years old. If they were reading NBA coverage, it's vastly different than it was when I started covering the league way back in '97. So they could be reading and exposed to a lot of like statistics that we wouldn't even have heard of 20 years ago. So they may be familiar with it. Do you think in the course of your time working in the NBA that has changed and actually helped the cause of being able to introduce a lot of data into these discussions, because players of this generation, this year's rookie class, for instance, probably have a much different view of these things than, 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think definitely they're more familiar. You don't have to do as much maybe educating on what certain metrics mean, or I think it's interesting. I think I've seen both players that have been maybe more receptive and open to it, but then also players who, because they've seen, maybe in the media or maybe within a team, like how much these numbers can like drive a conclusion about somebody. Like, again, when they feel like it's a surveillance mechanism or something to monitor them or something that's working against them, they're going to be less receptive to it. So really, like, I am very intentional about ensuring that the player feels safe and supported through this information and something that is theirs and that they have autonomy over, and not something that we're just using as a weapon. Like I said, it's a tool.
Has your approach to it changed over time? And again, I know your role has been different with different teams anyway, but when it comes to these conversations, whether it's with the coach or with players, have you kind of figured out over time how to adapt it, or have you adjusted it over time, learning what they might be more resistant to, or here's an approach that they're definitely going to, like, the walls go up and they're, pushing you away? How has that changed, evolved over time?
I don't think it's changed much. I think I've always kind of been like, build a relationship first, then let's learn from each other type of person. I think one thing I've realized, though, is as I've gone on, it's my 6th year in the league now, I do think at first not a lot of coaches were maybe as comfortable or familiar with it, but now I think a lot of coaches are actually, like, not dependent, but, like, they actually rely on it a little bit because they've, teams, they bounce around teams, they work with one team, they have, like, an analytics person on staff, then they go to another team, maybe they don't have that analytics person, then they're like, oh, well, I use this information now. Like, so I think something that's really important for organizations is actually, like, prioritizing building internal tools where coaches and players, for that matter, can interact with the data directly. Yeah. They don't need, like, a middleman. They don't need a liaison like me. Like, they can just interact with it themselves, especially for, the easier questions, the quick grabs. Like, build something that they can just interact with it themselves and have an interface that they feel comfortable with that's really user-friendly and that they don't need somebody to translate for them.
I would also just imagine, I don't know how often you kind of just slip this into the conversation, but that the fact that you had a high-level basketball career has to help, right? This isn't, again, the stereotypical nerd coming in with the numbers. Here I'm going to teach you about your, I'm not a basketball person, but I have all this data. You're coming in as grounded in basketball, in a basketball career of your own. Are the players and coaches aware of that? Are you kind of slipping it in there just to kind of make it clear, like, listen, I've got a grounding here that is, much more about the fundamentals than just a spreadsheet?
Yeah, I'm on court every single day. I'm putting players through workouts, so I think through that they pick up real quickly. Oh yeah, she played. Like,
they know. Yeah.
Like, they see me throw a pass or shoot, and they're like, oh yeah, she played. So I don't have to do a lot of convincing or, like, hey, I know what I'm talking about. I think it's just really, like, I want them to know that the language that they're speaking, like, I speak it too. Yeah. And that's the language I want to speak to them in anyways. And so that's where I go. And honestly, a lot of times when I do want to maybe come forward with some sort of data-driven recommendation or feedback, I often include video or, again, something they're very, very familiar with and that they can digest really easily. And then I can just pair the data with it, or complement it with the data, not just lead with the data.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I want to finish on this note. Everybody who has been on this series, at some point, I like to ask the kind of the what do we get wrong question, and by we, I mean media and fans. Whether it's about the way we think teams are using advanced stats, whether it's the actual stats we are using in our coverage or in conversations on Twitter. Do you have a sense, having worked in this space as long as you have, and also I'm sure being aware of the bad conversations we're having outside of that space, where are we going wrong? Where are the things where if you're reading a story and you say, you know what, I get what they were trying to do there, but don't use that particular stat or that kind of stat, or these are misused or misinterpreted. Where are the areas that you think fans and media go wrong the most? And, like, are there ones where you would say, use this one, not that one?
Yeah, I think the most common one I see is defensive stats. First of all, like, individual defense is just incredibly difficult to measure. Yeah. Defense is a very, like, collaborative effort. And so, I see sometimes, like, matchup data or something to that effect, and it's defined in a lot of different ways. It could be who was the matchup at the beginning of the possession, who was the matchup at the end, who was the closest defender when the shot was taken. Like, however you parse it, it's never going to fully capture what actually happened in the possession because there's so much that could happen. That could be schematic, where maybe there was an intentional switch or an intentional double team or something that caused the rotation, and now you're the last person on the offensive player, and but that wasn't your matchup, you know.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that could happen in a possession where that data point isn't telling the whole story, and you shouldn't draw a very conclusive decision based on it. But defensive stats in general are just, it's really difficult. You know, I think an interesting thought is we rely so much on the box score for a lot of our conclusions about what happens in a game. The box score was invented by some random guy, 40, 50 years ago, whatever, and it hasn't evolved a whole lot since then. It's still the basic steals, assists, rebounds, field goal attempts, etc. And we've kind of conceptualized the game as a whole based on the box score over time. And we haven't thought about well, what are other things the box score is not capturing? And defense is a big one. And example I can give is, the most optimal outcome on defense is to prevent a shot. You don't see that anywhere in any sort of metric, the prevention of a shot. You see a block.
Sure.
The shot got off and they blocked it. You see a steal. But what you don't see is there's a really great rotation. You close out and a hot shooter doesn't shoot it. He decides to pass it instead. That's an optimal outcome. That's a great defensive play. It doesn't show up anywhere. So there's a lot of stuff that, we're pretty good at measuring outcomes. We're not very good at measuring what didn't happen or what we prevented from happening.
So on that note, how much time have you spent actually trying to get to that? And do you have, I'm sure teams do, proprietary information that actually tells us not just whether or not the team scored or they got a shot off, but did we make them feed it to the weakest shooter as opposed to letting the guy with the 40% 3-point shot shoot it?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to the quality of the possession. And I think most teams have gotten to a point where they have their own metric for that, whatever matters to them as far as the quality of a shot or a quality of possession. But ultimately, you want to freeze the frame at the shot as the shot is taken and be are we happy with this? Is this what we wanted? And don't even know if it goes in or not, but just is this the outcome we wanted? Is this the behavior we wanted? So I think we're getting closer to that. I wouldn't say anybody's really, really good at evaluating individual defense at this point in time. It's really, really complex, and we're still kind of learning what matters. But maybe we'll get closer someday. But I think definitely the general public, I would say, misunderstands that a lot.
And probably that's the biggest area of misunderstanding is defense in general.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, just because it's so much of what didn't happen and less about what does happen.
Yeah. Well, Brittni, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking some time out to join us. I know you've got a lot left to do with the Hawks today and the rest of the week, and good luck the rest of the way in Summer League.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
My thanks again to Brittni Donaldson and to all of our guests in this series. I hope you enjoyed it and learned as much as I did. Again, if you missed the first 3 episodes with Kevin Pelton, Corey Jez, and Ben Taylor, you can find them all in this same feed. And before we go, I do have a small request for our listeners. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to the show and leave us a rating and review. Your feedback and support mean the world to us and help us reach more passionate sports enthusiasts like yourself. Also, I want to encourage you to explore Sports Business Classroom, the SBC, and discover the incredible resources it has to offer. Whether you're looking to enhance your knowledge of the sports industry, develop your skills, or network with industry professionals, SBC is the ultimate destination. To learn more about SBC and its valuable programs, visit sportsbusinessclassroom.com. Thank you for being part of our podcast community. We appreciate your continued support. Together, let's keep chasing our dreams and making a lasting impact in the world of sports.